Hi, Anne. It's great to be with you today, asking you a few questions about Josephine Butler. Maybe you could just start with sharing about what it is that you love about Josephine.
Well, that's difficult to summarize in a in a few words. Actually, somebody rang me up this morning and asked me what I was doing this morning, and I told him, and he said, "Oh, that great lady." And that's absolutely it. She is just such a great lady. Um, I first discovered her, I think, I don't know, about about 40 years ago, because I found some notes that I'd made, and my son, who's now 43, had been drawing on the notes as well. So it's a good long time ago. I was writing a chapter for a book, so I did quite a lot of research at that time. But I've continued to revisit her from time to time, and yeah, she just is such a wonderful, inspirational woman. And my prayer for this session is that it will inspire whoever listens in whatever area of society they are trying to make a difference. We're not all going to be Josephines, but we can be certainly look at her model of working and be inspired.
Thanks, Anne. And that's what we found in reading When Courage Calls during our book club that we're all discussing. We've been really impacted and affected by Josephine, but then the output is quite different for everyone. So we're quite
It
excited
is.
by that.
Yeah.
So, welcome to this interview with Anne. This is part of our When Courage Calls book club, and I've got three simple questions for Anne today. So, firstly, Anne, why did Josephine Butler reach out to the women in the workhouse?
Yeah. Well, just first of all, the context that in January 1866, Josephine and her family moved to Liverpool for her husband George to take up the position of principal at Liverpool College. And pretty soon afterwards, she started to visit the workhouse. Now, it wasn't unusual for women from her background to engage in charitable acts, but to visit the workhouse um, was fairly unusual, and it was also risky. Helen Mathers, in her book, Patron Saint to Prostitutes, records that actually one of the matrons had been beaten to death not long before. So she was taking a risk. So why did she do it? Well, I've picked out four brief reasons because I knew the questions ahead of time. Um, and actually, what I'm going to do, I hope you don't mind, is I've selected quite a lot of quotes from Josephine's own writings because she writes absolutely beautifully, and it's difficult to improve on what she says herself. Well, first of all, the first factor that was involved was it was a response to her grief at the loss of her little daughter Ava, who died at the age of 5 tragically in an accident in their house in Cheltenham when she fell down the stairs. And it happened just about 18 months before they moved to Liverpool. And I don't think it takes much imagination to realize how Josephine felt. She moved to Liverpool, a strange place. She was a country girl. She found herself in this large industrial city. Um, Previously, she'd been in Oxford and Cheltenham after her marriage, and uh, her husband would go off in the morning with the three boys, the three older children, to school, and she would be left and was getting more and more depressed, I think. And I think a cousin came to visit and suggested that she visited the workhouse. And this is what she says: I became possessed with an irresistible desire to go forth and find some pain keener than my own, to meet with people more unhappy than myself. My sole wish was to plunge into the heart of human misery and to say, as I knew I could now, to afflicted people, I understand. I too have suffered. And in fact, that's exactly what she does in one encounter in the workhouse. She takes a girl home and she says to her, do you want to come home with me? I once had a daughter. Um, it wasn't difficult to find misery in Liverpool. These are her words contingent. There was an immense workhouse containing at that time, it said, 5,000 people. There were extensive special wards where unhappy girls drifted like autumn leaves when the winter approached, many of them to die of consumption. So that's the first reason for her going. The second was her Christian faith. She firmly believed that Jesus was the answer to suffering. At the age of 17, she'd become a committed Christian, but only after a very long struggle. And she described one long year of darkness, during which she became acutely aware of the saddest miseries on the earth, the injustices, the inequalities, the cruelties. And she was absolutely haunted by the thought that God was an indifferent spectator to all of this suffering. But then she says, at last, I discovered a door of hope in Christ. I love that expression, a door of hope in Christ. So she knew that her faith in Christ gave her solace. And I think that her purpose later in life was to open a door of hope for others, including these women in the workhouse. And then thirdly, there was the influence of her father, John Gray. She describes him as a man with a fiery hatred of all injustice. And she admitted that she probably inherited his passion. And then she married George Butler in 1852, who also shared her convictions. He had a strong social conscience that was rooted in the Bible. And she explains the conviction that undergirded their married life. She said, compared with the accepted axioms of the day, and indeed of centuries past, in regard to certain vital questions, the sayings and actions of Jesus were, we confessed, to one another revolutionary. And actually, I was trying to find the quote this morning, but I couldn't find it. But I think it's true to say that they prayed together for what revolution they should be involved in. What should they be trying to effect in society? So what they were doing was examining the common accepted attitudes in society and in the light of Jesus' behavior and teaching. And they found society was deficient, particularly in the treatment of women. And then there was her early married life in Oxford. This would be the fourth influence, because up to that point, she'd lived in a very happy, large home, and suddenly she was plunged into this male-dominated world of Oxford, of the university. And she became increasingly aware of the double moral standard that ran right through Victorian society. And she mentions several incidents that she picks out herself as being significant in forming her convictions. I'll just mention two of them. The first was in 1853, Elizabeth Gaskell's novel Ruth, which is about an unmarried mother, was published. And she was dismayed that when the book was discussed in the Butler drawing room with a group of men there, Ruth was judged to be far more guilty than the man who'd seduced her. And in fact, one young man said, I wouldn't give it to my mother to read. And then second, at about the same time, Josephine discovered that a young woman who had been imprisoned in the notorious prison Newgate for allegedly killing her illegitimate child. She had been abandoned by the child's father, who was a university man. And Josephine wanted to visit the girl in prison, and George suggested that at the end of her sentence, the girl should come to them as a servant, which she did. Now, I'm mentioning these because it's very clear that well before she arrived in Liverpool, she was aware of the situation of many women in Victorian society, and she was already reaching out into what she called the world of unhappy women. And it was a big world. Yeah, so that's it. Four possible factors that influenced her in why she went.
Thank you, Anne. That's so helpful. And we've been so encouraged just reading through the book. And, you know, learning different things about her, seeing some of the difficulties she faced in the death of her child, and um, being in such a male-dominated environment. But what's one of the things that's really stood out to us is her relationship with her dad and her husband,
Yeah,
and just the beautiful way that she describes them. We were really drawn in the early chapters to her dad, and she's been described as too feminist for the Christians and too Christian for the feminists. And yet, as she speaks and lives, the way she speaks about men just honors them and values them so
absolutely.
much. So we're really struck actually that men and women can work together really well and really
Absolutely.
beautifully.
Absolutely. In fact, I've
Um,
got here, which I'm going to quote from shortly, but this is the book. You can see the size of it. Can you see the size of it? It's great tome. This is the book she wrote about her husband, Recollections of George Butler. And she did that. I mean, it puts me to shame the amount her volume in writing. That's, uh, yeah, it's, well, yeah, 400 odd pages that she wrote within 2 years of his death. Yeah, she couldn't speak highly enough of George.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Thanks, Anne. Okay, so second question is, how did she engage with the women?
Well, I'm going to quote quite a bit from her now. There was on the ground floor a bridewell for women, consisting of huge cellars, uh, bare and unfurnished, with damp stone floors. These were called the oakum sheds, where they came, driven by hunger, destitution, vice, begging for a few nights' shelter and a piece of bread, in return for which they picked their allotted portion of oakum. I went down to the oakum sheds and begged admission. Have you talked about what oakum is? It's um it's a tarred fibre that was used in shipbuilding. So essentially what they were doing was recycling from old tarry ropes and cables, and they had to pick their allotted amount in the day uh, to get a piece of bread. I was taken into an enormous, gloomy vault filled with women and girls, more than 200 at that time. So it was huge. I think I hadn't realized at first that it really was enormous. And then I love this. I sat on the floor among them and picked oakum. Interestingly, she didn't ask for a chair. She didn't stand aloof. She sat on the floor with them. Um, Remember, this is the wife of the headmaster of the public school. Um, it reminds me of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And her first visit was quite remarkable. I'm going to read you what she says. Um, right, so she sat on the floor among them and picked oakum. I wonder what you thought their response was, but this is what she tells us. They laughed at me and told me my fingers were of no use for that work, which was true. But while we laughed, we became friends. I proposed that they should learn a few verses to say to me on my next visit. Now, presumably, the women were mainly illiterate, so she was teaching them verses. She was teaching them the scriptures. They knew very little, many of them, not all of them, but some of them. Um, I recollect a tall, handsome girl standing up in our midst among the damp refuse and lumps of tarred rope and repeating without a mistake that wonderful 14th chapter of St. John's Gospel. The words of Jesus all through, ending with, "Peace I leave you, my peace I give you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." She had selected it herself, and they listened in perfect silence. This audience, wretched, ignorant, criminal some, wild and defiant others. The tall, dark-haired girl had prepared the way for me, and I said, "Now let us all kneel and cry to that same Jesus who spoke those words." And down on their knees they fell, every one of them, reverently, on that damp stone floor, some saying the words after me, others moaning and weeping. It was a strange sound, that continuous, pitiful, strong, a great sigh or murmur, a vague desire and hope, issuing from the heart of despair, piercing the gloom and murky atmosphere of that room and reaching to the heart of God. So it was a truly remarkable meeting. She went down among them, sat with them on the floor, and she started to build a relationship with them. She called them friends. She wasn't sitting in judgment. She wanted to relate to these women, and later on she heard their stories. She was compassionate. She showed she really cared. And crucially, I think she offered them a glimpse of hope in this terrible, despairing situation. And the result of her visits to the workhouse, the hospitals, quays, Oakham sheds, was, in her words, to draw down on my head an avalanche of miserable but grateful womanhood. She began to take some of the terminally ill home from the workhouse to her own home, and people were scandalized. This was the headmistress's wife, and she was taking these creatures into her home. One of those was a girl called Marion, who lived with them for 3 months before she died. Josephine calls her a sort of first fruits of what's to come. She was a farmer's daughter who'd been sexually abused at the age of 15 by an older man. When her mother came for the funeral, she talked about that man who ruined my child. Most of the women in the workhouse, like Marion, were illiterate or semi-literate. And so when talking to people like her, Josephine seems to have adopted the approach of reading to them and responding to their questions about the Gospels. It wasn't always, sometimes didactic, but she was letting them, she gave them plenty of freedom to ask their questions. She talks about the long conversations that she and her husband had with Marion in the evenings. Now, it's quite different from the approach that she adopted with more educated, literate people, where she was more confrontational and asked questions. That isn't obvious with these women. I'll just give you a couple of examples. The way she adapted what she did is fascinating. She once challenged an Oxford Dom in their drawing room. And she probably wasn't 25 at the time, maybe 25, 26. And a painting by Raphael was under discussion. It was a painting of a woman in prayer. And Josephine said that the woman's face looked insipid. And this distinguished academic said, oh, well, the face of any woman in prayer looks insipid. Well, Josephine was incensed. So she asked him, in response, did he really believe that when two intelligent men converse together, that the face became insipid? And this was her question. Doesn't it rather beam with increased intelligence and exalted thought? How much more if one converses with the highest intelligence of all? So what she'd done with her question was laid bare his assumption about God and women and the nature of prayer, which she argues he was dismissing as a kind of sentimental feeling. So her witness was really very effective. She, on another occasion, she was asked to address a group of male undergraduates in Cambridge in 1879, during which she challenged the double standard in morality. In other words, that there's one code of morality for men and another for women. And she points out that this double standard has marked every age and all teaching. But she adds, and I just love this statement. I'm always quoting it in evangelistic talks. Uh, there stands on the page of history one marked exception. And so far as I know, only one, that of Christ. And then she asked these male undergraduates, what did they think of Christ? And she tells them the story from John 8 of the woman who's taken in adultery and dragged before Jesus in the temple courts, and he's asked to judge her. And what she does as she unpacks that incident is she challenges their assumptions and highlights the uniqueness of Christ in his treatment of women and argues that they should follow him in their own treatment of women. Now, that's just as an aside, her different methods, but one of the results of her visits to the workhouse was that the Butler house became absolutely overwhelmed, and she realised she needed to take some practical steps. So the Butlers hired another house. At the time, I don't think they could quite afford it, but they relied on friends to help them. They took it in faith. And they started, it eventually became what was called a house of rest, and it became a hospital for the incurable. Initially, she had one woman helping her. And then in 1867, the industrial home was established with the help of a number of Liverpool merchants and others. And it was to increase women's employment. And she was, all the time, she was passionate about women's education. So women could be employed and not at risk. So, yeah, we don't have a huge amount of detail about the conversations, but that's it. I think, well, as far as I can tell, that's what I can work out.
Thank you, Anne. And something you said then reminds me of a bit from the book where Sarah Williams says every encounter Jesus had with women involved liberation.
Mm,
And just really what you're saying about how it was who Josephine knew Jesus to be that really impacted
yeah,
her view of what it means to be made in the image of God, both men and women. So
yeah,
we really, really impacted actually that a view like that should change us dramatically. And
yeah.
particularly as we talk to our friends about, is Christianity good for women? Is the church good for women? Is Jesus good for women? Actually going back to who Jesus was and every encounter he had with women
Yes,
involved
I
liberation.
nearly put
Just
that quote in. I don't, yeah,
yeah,
that every encounter that Jesus had
yeah,
ended in an act of liberation.
yeah,
Yeah,
just amazing.
it
So
is.
that takes us really nicely into the implications for us. So as you've looked at Josephine, studied her life, looked at the different things that have happened to her, and I mean, she was in lots of different places through her life. She traveled
There
a
she
lot,
was.
didn't she?
Yeah.
What do you think are the implications for us going forwards from learning about Josephine?
Mm. Well, in many ways, she's quite daunting. She's definitely a one-off. Um, she was so courageous. I mean, uh, there was an early description of the way she hunted as a girl when she was out hunting on a horse, that she was incredibly bold. And I think that carried over into the way that she lived life. So she was somewhat naturally courageous, very gifted, well educated for the time. She spoke French and Italian almost fluently, cultivated. I mean, one of the things she did was, in Oxford, they mixed with some of the pre-Raphaelite painters, and she went and visited Dante Gabriel Rossetti's studio. So you have this very cultivated woman who did these amazing things. But the root of it all wasn't so much natural giftedness, but it was rooted in her spiritual life. She cultivated her spiritual life. There's a lovely expression. She says, "Long ago, I asked a gift of God, companionship with Christ." Um, and prayerful meditation and Bible reading were really part of her life. And she really believed in the power of prayer, contrary to the Oxford Don that she contradicted. She really believed in the power of prayer. Uh, I have seen a quote from Sarah Williams, which I think is beautiful. She said, she lived a life immersed in prayer. And I think that's it. That's the foundation. That for all of us, if we, it's so easy to do things in our own strength and our own bright ideas. But yeah, that was it. It was spiritual. The second thing was she was a team player. Um, as her ministry among unhappy women in Liverpool grew, she involved others, especially in providing practical assistance, but not just practical. I mean, sometimes her sister came visiting the workhouse with her and other women. So she definitely involved others. She fronted the campaign against contagious diseases acts, but she didn't go into battle alone. George, in particular, was enormously supportive and paid the price for it, actually. And many others were involved, including, you've already mentioned, the large numbers praying, which she didn't take for granted. That was essential. And then I'd say, thirdly, that she went to people. She didn't wait for people to come knocking on her door. She went out to people, engaged with them in different situations and different ways that were appropriate for them. So actually, again, she's modeling herself on Jesus in different situations and different ways of approaching people. Yeah.
Thank you, Anne. That's so helpful. I've so appreciated listening to you talk about Josephine and bring out maybe some different strands and threads that we've not yet read about in the book club. Is there anything else you'd like to say in conclusion?
Well, I think I better read the book,
That's a
which
good
I
bit.
haven't read yet because I'm working on a book and I'm no Josephine. I don't write at her speed. Um, no, I just think she's remarkable.
Yeah. And the quote I think you were trying to remember earlier was that they prayed together that a holy revolution might come about and
That's
that the
it.
kingdom of God might be established on the earth.
Yeah, that's it.
So it's a great place to leave as an implication for us. Let's continue that prayer of Josephine and George
Absolutely.
Butler that a
Yeah,
holy revolution might come about. So, Anne, thank you so much for your time today. We're so grateful for you.
pleasure. Privileged to talk about her.